We're joined now by Christopher Snowdon of the Economic Affairs Institute, and we've still got chef and food writer Yotam Ottolenghi with us. And actually, this is the first time since this crisis dawned that you've been out on television, though I've seen you on Twitter. I mean, what is your take? What do you think the problem really is?
In my mind, as a chef, I probably eat anything and everything. I would eat horse meat if I had to,
Pink
or if it was or a nice salami. But the problem is that the prevalence of processed foods, and I think this is something that people really don't stop to think. I mean, what I wrote on Twitter was a very short message after a program on Radio 4 that I said, just don't eat processed meat.
So you're not actually shocked to find that there is horse meat knocking around in the food chain?
I'm not shocked because everything is too cheap. So, some other cheap meat will eventually find itself into the food chain. Because people eat too much processed food, they end up getting nasty surprises when they and I said earlier in this program, I said people should just cook.
Can people afford not to eat processed food? Is cooking invariably cheaper?
I think it is probably cheaper to cook vegetables than to eat processed meat. And I think if people cooked more vegetables, and there is plenty of vegetables around that are people can afford them, then I'd rather them do that than eat some piece of meat that's been processed.
Christopher Snowdon, I mean, you're a great fan of cheap food.
Absolutely, yes. Look at your last item and look at this item. Everyone seems to be complaining about things being too cheap. This is the narrative of our times.
But if it takes horse meat to get it cheap enough...
People have been... I mean, this is, the horse meat incident, this is a straightforward case of fraud. People have been passing off various different foods for centuries. It happens in restaurants, it happens in small shops. It's not specific to processed food.
Yeah, but fraud flourishes where there is a market in getting something cheaper than it can actually really be produced.
There is always a market for getting things cheaper. I mean, the free market is based on the idea that you want to...
Well, hence the fact that fraud can occur on some scale in order to engineer cheap food.
Indeed, it's not just food, it's anything. There will always be an incentive to cut costs. Now, the food supply is regulated to the nth degree. The reason that we didn't spot that there was horse meat in it was because we didn't think to test for it. We test for lots of other things. The food supply is perfectly safe. I dare say now we'll be spending millions of pounds setting up some new quango to test it for cat and toad and everything else. But it's not a specific issue to supermarkets. It's certainly not the case that food is too cheap, and if we made it more expensive, you're less likely to have this problem.
Excuse me, don't you think that if meat was more expensive than vegetables, by definition, then people would eat more healthily?
Meat is more expensive than vegetables.
Why do we have? No, you can buy a chicken for £2. Why do we have to have meat 3 times a day and in each plate?
You can buy enough vegetables to have a meal for £1. I mean, things are cheap, and this is a fantastic thing. It's very annoying to me.
But there's a bias towards meat.
What, that meat is cheaper than vegetables?
There's a sort of cultural view that you've got to eat meat.
Well, that's what people want to do. I'm only interested in people's purchasing choices reflecting their true preferences. But, that's true for alcohol, and it's true for the fizzy drinks we were talking about earlier.
Making meat so cheap also damages the environment. I mean, the fact that cows are roaming all over the place and people are eating meat for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner. 1 or 2 generations ago, you ate meat once a day, or maybe every other day. We eat meat all the time, and it's not sustainable, not health-wise, and not to the planet.
It's perfectly sustainable. People, as they get richer, eat more meat. This is true over history.
It's not sustainable.
It's perfectly sustainable.
No, it's extremely damaging to global warming, for example. I mean, clearly the methane emissions and the rest of it, and of course the incredible costs of actually using up all this land for arable activity.
Sure, but I mean, people aren't starving because people are eating meat. I mean, you can look maybe 50 years down the line and say this is no longer going to be sustainable. At the moment, it's perfectly sustainable. We're very lucky to have a meat supply which is relatively cheap, but food is still a big part of a lot of people's budgets. And it's all right having people, wealthy restaurateurs or doctors on 6-figure salaries saying that everything's too cheap and we should be trying to put the price up.
Well, doesn't it in the end come down to the incredible stranglehold that the cartel of supermarkets that exist in this country who are always trying to equal each other's prices.
Absolutely, and I think the biggest problem is that prices have gone down without a standard of quality being maintained. And when you find horse meat in your mince or in your lasagna, you ask why is it there and why did it end up there? Because it was the demand of the supermarket was for it to be so cheap, and that's unsustainable.
You're going about it completely the wrong way around. If meat was more expensive, there would be more incentive for people to bring in cheap horse meat and so on.
I have to disagree on that.
Well, then it would be sold as horse meat, which would be fair enough.
Which is fine. I think we've all got a taste for horse meat now.
Well, why not do that instead of introducing it into beef and selling it as beef?
Because it's being passed off because that's where the market is, and there's no test for horse. There is now, and maybe they'll move on to something else.
Because the supermarkets would do whatever it takes to give you cheap meat, whatever it is.
The supermarkets haven't been behind this.
We're going to have to pause it there, but I'm grateful to both of you very warmly for coming in. Thank you. Christian.